appreciate the introduction by Jack. I figure by now, this is the fourth time I've been introduced. You all might be getting tired of being introduced to me. To me, it's kind of fun. It's interesting to see what, if Jack can come up with new nice things to say about me. But no, I appreciate that introduction, Jack. And I'm really excited to be here. Jack is right. I am nervous. I want you all to know that I am going into this by no means professing to be perfect or infallible or to know everything. But I go into this planning to be as humble as I can be and work as hard as I can be and be as consistent as I can be. And because that's what you all deserve. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. I think one thing that's going around in my mind right now is that whoever said being a Christian isn't an adventure, doesn't know what they're talking about. Because seriously, I mean, just putting your faith in God, you think about Abraham and where his faith took him. And but it's true. I would have never guessed that I would be here even 2 years ago. I mean, 3 years ago, I was not thinking about being a preacher at all. And here I am, and God works in mysterious ways, and I'm thankful to be here in front of you, and more importantly, to be a member of this congregation. So thank you for hiring me and for allowing me to be a part of the work here in South Salem Church of Christ. To all the mothers, I want to say two things. Happy Mother's Day. The second thing I want to say is what I say to my mother every Mother's Day. I tell her Happy Mother's Day, and then I tell her, you're welcome. You couldn't have done it without me. No, but if you're a mother here today, the focus of this sermon is we want to appreciate mothers, because what Jack said this morning is true, that God has always honored mothers. And the unfortunate reality within our modern society today is that mothers and motherhood are becoming more and more devalued as time continues to pass by. I recently read an article that showed and discussed the fact that the percentage of the American population who are mothers is at the lowest it has been in 25 years, and it continues to trend downwards. And we may ask the question, why is this? And we could speculate and look for an answer all day, but the simple fact is this. Other things have become more important in the eyes of many in society today. Family is no longer a priority. And this is evident to me in many different respects. As a 25-year-old man, I noticed that few men my own age are in search of a woman who wants to settle down and raise a family. But we have to understand that it's also a two-way street. Because it's not just men, it's women also. More and more women are beginning to view motherhood simply as an unwanted or not worthwhile burden, and are therefore looking for fulfillment through other means. Perhaps modern man's disinterest in family and failure to see the beauty in a woman who desires to raise a family, along with modern woman's failure to see the beauty and fulfillment that can come from raising children, are two big reasons why promiscuity, sexual perversion, and abortion have increased exponentially in the last few decades. Ironically, it's those who put their faith in God and call themselves, as we call ourselves, Christians, that are often accused of being chauvinistic bigots who fail to see women for what they really are, valuable. The reason this is ironic to me is because the Bible's valuation of women, although at times admittedly poorly represented by some believers today, the Bible's valuation of women could not be more opposite of what the world says of us and what they think the Bible says. Make no mistake about it. Women, and specifically this morning, mothers and those who embark in motherhood, are precious in the eyes of the Lord.
Amen.
And not only are they precious in the eyes of the Lord, but they are an integral part of God's plan. We see that all the way back at the beginning. Genesis chapter 1. And what's that 3-word phrase that we read over and over again in Genesis chapter 1? God said it was good. He says, let there be light. He creates the sun, the moon, the stars, the fish of the sea, plants, animals. He says it was good. Finally, Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. God creates man. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And then you drop down to verse 31. And Moses pens it that the words of God were tov meod, that everything was very good. In the garden, everything was good. And we see from the beginning that family, and again specifically we're talking this morning about motherhood. Motherhood was not a curse. It was a blessing. Sometimes a common mistake that's made is that when the curse was given to woman, we read that as it was a curse to have children. But we understand that's not the case. The curse to the woman was that the pain would be multiplied in childbearing. Women bearing children and raising up kids along with their spouse was always part of the plan. That's what God said before the fall of man in Genesis chapter 1, in verse 28. God told them, be fruitful and multiply. So let's get this straight. When God created the heavens and the earth, land and sea, the birds and the fish, plants and all living animals, before the fall of man, when everything was said to be good by God himself, the idea of family was already in place. Family was part of the perfection that took place in the garden. And that's something that we still have today. That's why I say family is integral for a good life. That's something that is built inside all of us. And you may have heard this before, but it's been said a nation is only as strong as its family. In other words, having a nation full of people who value family and have strong families themselves are what will cause any nation to thrive. The scary thing about the devaluation of mothers and motherhood and family as a whole is that it leaves us empty. And when we feel empty, we often reach for other things to fill that void. Often unhealthy things. This often leads to a moral decline. Having families is part of what we were made to be and do, literally. Genesis chapter 1. God made man with the desire to be fathers and husbands. He made woman to be wives and mothers. And so what's going to happen when we neglect these God-given purposes and desire in favor of money and careers or whatever else it may be? The nation as a whole is already there in some ways, perhaps. But the church, which is to be a buttress or the pillar of truth, according to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, cannot afford to go in that same direction. And we'll come back to that thought, that idea. We'll circle back around to that. But we see that from the beginning, family, mothers and motherhood, it was integral to God's plan and it remains integral for a good life today. But not only that, we see it's also integral to God's plan of salvation being realized. We know that the fall took place, but it was followed by a great promise in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. A promise given to woman via the curse given to Satan. It's there that it reads, I will put enmity between you and the woman. This is God talking to the serpent. And between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. God's promise was to put enmity between the serpent's seed and woman's seed. And we see this first messianic prophecy given. And it says that he would be born to a woman and come in the form of a man. And God said in Genesis 3:15 that he will bruise Satan's head. He's going to crush Satan's head. And in return, Satan would bruise his heel. By this we know it talks about his death. The Son of God, the seed of this woman, would taste death. But as Peter says in Acts chapter 2, before he quotes Psalm 16, in verse 24, he says, God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. This offspring, this seed that is prophesied in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, is talking about someone who was and is perfect. Someone who was so perfect that he became a sacrifice that was to be made one time for all time. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10. Someone who could not stay dead, but would overcome death, bringing salvation to all and crushing Satan's head for good. This one, God promised, would come through the seed of woman. The story of salvation would begin to be realized and be fulfilled, and would start with a faithful woman becoming a mother. But we know it would take a miracle. In Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, 750 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, it was prophesied there that the Lord himself would give Israel a sign. He says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The prophecy explicitly says he'll be born to a virgin, a miraculous virgin. And for the woman, this was indicative of the fact that she was a woman who walked by faith in the Lord as seen in her conduct. She would not just be any woman, but one whom the Lord would look down upon with favor. And it's easy to see why we would say that the Lord looked down upon her with favor. Because this child is said by Isaiah to have a few different names. We see in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, the first name that's given is Emmanuel, God with us. In Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, we're told that his name would also be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And we know that woman wound up being Mary, whom the angel called, as Jack alluded to and read, O favored one, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 28. It also says in verse 30 that the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary, you have found favor with God. And it's no wonder that the angel of the Lord referred to her in this way, as even Mary realized what this meant for her. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 48, when she's giving thanksgiving to God for putting her in this situation, she says, he has looked on the humble estate of his servant, for behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed. She was blessed to be the first one to have a relationship with the Son of God. God's plan began to come to fruition through motherhood. And by doing this, God not only showed favor toward Mary, but also showed just how highly he values women of faith. As Mary, a woman of faith, was integral to God's plan of salvation. And we see that she rejoiced. She says, "My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior." She wasn't perfect. This was her Savior too. She was blessed. We see that mothers and motherhood were integral to God's plan of salvation being realized. And we look at today. Not only is it important historically to our faith, but mothers and motherhood are integral to the church today. A church is only as strong as its families. I said that we come back to this idea of a nation being as strong as its families. There's a lot of truth to that. And it's an idea that I firmly believe in. But we even have philosophers who have said the same exact thing. Confucius said the strength of a nation derives from the integrity of the home. And I think about this idea, and I think about what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 9, where he says, "You are a chosen race," he's talking to Christians, "a royal priesthood, a holy nation." A holy nation. The church is a nation of God's chosen special people. The nation is only as strong as its family. That's the integrity of the home. And so this statement is not just true for our own physical nation that we live in today, but more importantly, the church of God's people. What's to happen to God's holy nation, to the local church, if we go the way of society and devalue the home, family, and specifically this morning, mothers and motherhood? I would submit to you the local church would suffer greatly. Because we need faithful mothers in the church. It is an integral part to God's plan for the local church. And we think about ideas such as perpetuated leadership. I'm talking about not just being a leader, but raising leaders and repeating that for generations to come within the church. Women play a great role in this. Mothers play a great role in this. In raising children, both men and women. But we know a woman, a mother, can play a vital role in raising up men who will be faithful and serve the Lord, whether it be as deacons, as elders, as preachers. Maybe they don't wear any of those titles, but they're serving God nonetheless. I think about my own family, and the first person that became a Christian in my family was my great-grandmother. And then her daughters became Christians. And then my mom became a Christian. And I became a Christian, and my brothers became a Christian, and my brother serving as a deacon. These mothers in my life weren't just raising Christians, but they were raising leaders. And some of them were raising men who would go on to be leaders in the church. But this is a very biblical idea too. Most notably, I think about Timothy, Paul's son in the faith, and the influence that mothers had on his development. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul writes to Timothy and he says, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you." You look at this man who would become a leader within local churches, a preacher, somebody that Paul referred to as his son in the faith. And where did that all start? It started with his grandmother and his mother raising him up in the Lord. We always talk about how we want to leave a great mark on this world. But one of the easiest ways to begin changing the world is to bring up children in the Lord and teaching them to do the same.
Amen.
Again, we see that women are required for perpetuated leadership. I also think about what Paul says to Titus. In Titus chapter 2. In Titus chapter 2, he says, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children. Mothers and women, they play a vital role in the church, teaching what is good, being an example to those who are younger. Whether it's how to be a wife, how to be a mother, how to be a Christian. This is a role that needs to be filled and continue to be filled within the church. It's a vital part that needs to be functioning properly. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16, Paul says that from the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. This is a part of the church that needs to continue to be working properly so that the church can grow and build itself up in love and continue to thrive. We look at these things, and I by no means want to give more glory to women or mothers than to God. We know that all glory goes to God. But the purpose of looking at these things is so that we can realize just how special mothers and that role of motherhood are to God. And when we realize that, that should provoke us to do something ourselves. When we realize how special mothers and motherhood are, we must honor our mothers ourselves. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 2, we're familiar with that passage. It says, honor your father, yes, but also your mothers. He says this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Honor your father and mothers. We look, this is something that isn't supposed to stop when we become an adult. This is something that we are always to do. Because not only are we to honor them, but we're also to be taking care of our mothers when the time comes. This is something that is commanded in 1 Timothy. And you notice in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul is there talking about how those who are children of widows have an obligation to take care of their widowed mothers. And he says in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do we think that God wants us to appreciate, yes, members of our household, but here in the context also others? Really what we're doing is we're following a pattern given by Jesus himself. In John chapter 19, in verse 25, there Jesus is on the cross, and it says, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, Jesus said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own house. Many people understand the disciple whom Jesus loved here to be the apostle John. And what is it that Jesus is doing? Here he is dying on the cross. And he says, woman, behold your son. And he says to John, behold your mother. He's saying, take care of her. Here he is dying on the cross, giving everything for everyone, including his mother. And he's thinking about who is going to take care of my mom. The Son of God. Do we think that God holds mothers in high esteem, mothers of faith? Yes, he does. In Proverbs chapter 31, and in verse 10, it says, an excellent wife who can find, she is far more precious than jewels. But not only is she a wife, we drop down to verse 28, we also see that she is a mother. And it says, her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. And what is it precisely that makes her so valuable? There is one thing that she is doing that affects everything she does. That one thing is found in verse 30. He says, charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Now that's interesting to me. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And we're going to finish here. This is the last scripture reading I have. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 10. Verse 13. The writer, presumably Solomon, says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. This whole book, all of life comes down to this one statement. The end of the matter, all has been heard. What is it? Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. The proverb writer says, an excellent wife who can find, she is far more precious than jewels. Everything she does is affected by the fact that she is a woman who fears the Lord. And she's perpetuating that within her own family. God says a woman who fears the Lord and teaches her own to do the same. And allows the fear of God to affect everything that she does. God says this person is more precious, far more precious than jewels. So this morning, I know it's a shorter lesson, but I simply just want to urge us, not just today, but continually, we should be thankful to God for providing mothers and the role of motherhood and wives. And if you are a young woman here, we should be praying for individuals that they are still striving to be like the Proverbs 31 woman, that they are still striving to do what God designed, what God built into us to do, which is to be fruitful and multiply, to raise people up in the Lord. So if you're here this morning, I know we haven't talked about the plan of salvation too much, but if you would like to talk about salvation and what it takes to become a Christian, and how to obey the gospel, or if you have any spiritual needs whatsoever at this time, please come forward while we stand and sing the song of invitation.